Hi, my name is Elise, and this is my final political philosophy project for Professor Terza. Adam Smith was born in Scotland in 1723. He attended the University of Glasgow and studied moral philosophy there. He then became a professor at the University of Glasgow, teaching logic, philosophy, and literature, 13 years before the release of his first work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in 1759. In this work, Smith theorizes that human morality is based in mutual sympathy. His next work, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, took an economic approach to his theory of ethics. In this text, he argues that self-interest benefits a capitalist society as a whole by driving production. Sigmund Freud was born to Ashkenazi Jewish parents in Freiburg, a town in the Austrian Empire, in 1856. He attended the University of Vienna and became a medical doctor, specializing in neuropathology in 1881. He began practice in Vienna in 1886, but had to leave due to the Nazi annexation of Austria in 1938. He died a year later in the United Kingdom. He is known for founding the discipline of psychoanalysis and techniques such as free association and transference. Freud is also known for a psychosexual theory of development and the unconscious, which posit that humans contain an id, an ego, and superego that balance each other's drives. Though Freud and Smith released their major works in different centuries, Freud's theories on psychosexual development and the human mind support Adam Smith's economic theory that self-interest regulates a capitalist economy. Section 2, Theory of Moral Sentiment and Wealth of Nations. In Adam Smith's first work, The Theory of Moral Sentiment, he argues that rather than coming from religion or divine authority, moral frameworks develop through testing our interactions with people. Over time, as people interact, they decide whether behavior is acceptable. He says that people must act within these general norms of society in order to gain approval and mutual respect. An impartial spectator within us forms our conscience and helps us decide what seems morally right and wrong in that moment. This line of thought was revolutionary at a time when reason was seen as the only way to analyze human behavior and decision-making. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith claims that men have an inherent propensity to make selfish decisions. However, he claims that this self-interest actually benefits society under a capitalist economy because he believes that incentives can be used to motivate workers. An invisible hand that is dictated by the law of supply and demand ideally listens to the decisions of the consumers, giving them some control over production in their societies. YouTuber The School of Life created a video outlining Adam Smith's economic theory, and they split it up into 4 different parts, which included specialization, consumer capitalism, rich people's greed, and educating consumers. Specialization they defined to be the way that Adam Smith proposed that labor be split up. Specialization happens in an industrialized society in order to create the most productive line of work. The unfortunate part of this is labor alienation, which Marx discusses in the readings that we did in class, where workers can feel alienated from their work and just like a cog in the wheel. Smith says that bosses have a responsibility to remind workers of the dignity of their labor and reconnect them to that labor. Consumer capitalism is defined as workers producing manufactured goods for a broadening upper middle class. This promoted luxury consumerism, which produces excess wealth, which ultimately is supposed to trickle down to the weakest in society under Smith's theory. Smith believed that excess capital produced under a capitalist system should serve us in this way and serve lower classes. The third section outlined how to get rich people to share their wealth, because in a capitalist society, disparities in wealth happen naturally, and bosses get richer while working class gets poorer. While the predominant thought to control this was enacting higher taxes, Smith thought that this would cause the wealthy upper classes to actually just leave the country and not participate in that economy, which is why he advocated for laissez-faire economics. And he ultimately decided in his writings that the great secret of education is to direct vanity to proper objects, which is a direct quote. Basically, he thought that the wealthy sought wealth for vanity and for respect. Wealth equaled status rather than just wealth. The fourth point in his writings, which was the education of consumers, placed the blame on consumers to make better choices in order to influence the invisible hand and the laws of supply and demand under capitalism. Consumers must be taught to like better quality things and make better decisions in order to influence production in the long run. In this way, Smith thought that capitalism was the most liberal economic system that was possible and placed great emphasis on the reason that was inherent to humans. Number 3, Freuds Civilization and its discontents. In Civilization and its discontents, Freud explains the conflict between an individual and his society. Civilization would demand that fundamental bad instincts be repressed while man desires to indulge these instincts. This is a perfect example of the pleasure principle versus the reality principle. The ability to suppress these instincts comes from the id, ego, and superego, which developed through childhood. Freud developed his theory of id, ego, and superego from his first book, The Interpretation of Dreams. Here he considers the presence of a preconscious, a conscious, and an unconscious within the human mind. The preconscious stores information that is not immediately needed, the conscious is the most present form of your mind, and the unconscious is inaccessible except for during sleep and dreaming. Freud placed emphasis on the role of parents in developing the unconscious mind in his Oedipus complex theory, in which a son has the instinctual desire to murder his father and be with his mother. The female counterpart to this theory is called the feminine Oedipus complex and just reverses the gender. The theory of the id, ego, and superego parallel Freud's consciousness theory, but work as active agents within us rather than categories of thought and memory. The id represents our primal, libidinal desires for things like sex, food, etc., and is fully unconscious. The superego internalizes societal rules and cultural norms and produces guilt in response to unacceptable desires of the id. The superego is partially conscious. If the former are the two extremes, the ego is the partially conscious mediator between them. The ego acts according to the reality principle and seeks to please the id's drives in a realistic way that account for long-term consequences. The reality principle drives the ego because it governs our ability to process outside information and norms. Freud also believed that there were two fundamental human drives: the life drive, which acts according to the pleasure principle and seeks immediate gratification, and the death drive, which opposes eros, the tendency towards survival and reproduction. Id and self-interest, and the invisible hand. Both men developed theories that primarily focus on an analysis of self and the individual. Freud's concept of the id, which represents our most primal desires, reflects Smith's theory that human nature is driven by a desire for personal profit. In his theory of psychosexual development that begins when we are born, Freud says that the id only knows its own desires and needs. This is called the oral stage, when every decision is driven by the pleasure principle. This ends when the anal stage of development begins, and the child begins to develop an ego, which must negotiate with the id. A sense of self that is beginning to grow motivates this negotiation in an attempt to follow directions or act like role models. Smith argues in a similar way that a sense of self informs the reason that governs human behavior. While Smith says this in a scope of economic theory, the sentiment echoes throughout both texts. A quote from Smith's book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, reads, "In short, the self-interest of some provides all with the necessaries of life. Self-interest thus not only advances the individual's interests, but also advances the interest of the society." Death drive / eros and rich immorality. Through his practice, Freud came to realize that his theory of the pleasure principle was conflicted by a tendency for patients to remember or reenact events that were negative in their lives. For example, veterans of World War I, whom he treated frequently, would often have episodes of PTSD. At this time, trauma was not believed to have lasting effects on mental health as we understand it to now. It seemed to him that there was a drive separate from the one that constantly sought pleasure because these patients could not control these urges of memory. We talked about Smith's theory of selfishness and how it drives society to an overall beneficial state. However, this did not mean he believed that all resources would be distributed across society evenly. He acknowledges that an inescapable condition of a free market is a disparity in wealth due to greed. He says, though, that this wealthy class has the free will to benefit lower classes through philanthropy and demand for goods, which boosts production. Smith opposed heavy taxation because he believed that it made upper classes vacate the country where they held capital. Both men believe that there is an inherent negative within human nature. For Smith, it was greed, which he hoped to be balanced by a feeling of mutual sympathy and empathy, and for Freud, it was a death drive that opposed eros and the seeking of reproductivity and life. Superego and moral sentiments. In the theory of moral sentiments, Smith tells us that mutual sympathy is the basis of morality. As stated earlier in this video, we base our moral frameworks off of what we read as acceptable from other people. Freud believes that this moral framework is present as well, shown in this quote from his work, The Ego and the Id. In many criminals, especially youthful ones, it is possible to detect a very powerful sense of guilt which existed before the crime, and is therefore not its result, but its motive. It is as if it was a relief to be able to fasten this unconscious sense of guilt onto something real and immediate. The concept of guilt indicates the knowledge of a moral right and wrong. While Freud believes that this negative feeling comes from deficiencies in the upbringing of a child, resulting in an unmet want of the id, it is still derived from the notion of a societal definition of crime. The modern significance of a comparative analysis between Freud and Smith's theories lies in the question of whether we live out their hypotheses every day. We participate in capitalism every day. We all have deep, unconscious, id-like desires that show themselves every day. We might be able to use Freud's analysis to understand Smith's prediction of how individuals under capitalism will fare as we continue into a laissez-faire future.